Mental health is something we both care deeply about. And back in 2016, we launched Heads Together, a campaign supported by so many wonderful partners that help break the stigma around mental health and encourage more people to have everyday conversations about it. Alongside the efforts of many others, we have seen real change. Today, more people feel empowered to talk about their mental health than ever before. This is a major step forward.
The moment Princess Catherine saw those DNA results, everything changed. Her hands trembled, her vision blurred, and then, in front of everyone, she collapsed. What the test revealed was so explosive, so unthinkable, that even the strongest composure couldn't withstand it. Princess Diana's deepest secret.
It's always been my concern to touch people with leprosy, trying to show in a simple action that they are not reviled, nor are we repulsed.
The one the palace fought desperately to bury had just been confirmed. It started like any other day. Catherine had scheduled a standard health checkup, the kind that members of the royal family undergo regularly as part of their duties. These appointments are always handled with the utmost discretion, conducted away from public view, in the secure medical wings of royal residences. For someone in Catherine's position, medical privacy is not just preferred, it's essential. She arrived expecting nothing more than the usual tests and examinations that had become routine over her years as a senior member of the family. The medical staff greeted her professionally, as they always did. The environment was familiar and controlled, exactly what one would expect in such circumstances. But as the consultation progressed, something caught Catherine's attention. Among the standard paperwork and medical forms, there was a line that stood out from the rest. It read simply, "DNA confirmation required." The phrasing was clinical and matter-of-fact, but it struck Catherine as unusual. She had been through countless medical procedures over the years and had never seen this particular requirement listed in quite this way. Catherine is known for her attention to detail and her ability to read situations carefully. These qualities have served her well in navigating the complexities of royal life. So when she noticed this notation, her instincts told her something was different about this appointment. DNA testing is not unheard of in medical settings, of course. It can be used for various legitimate health reasons, from checking for genetic predispositions to certain conditions, to confirming familial relationships for medical history purposes. But the way it was presented here felt deliberate, as though it had been specifically requested rather than being part of standard protocol. She decided to ask the attending physicians about it. Her question was posed calmly and naturally, the way she had learned to inquire about sensitive matters without causing alarm. Why was DNA testing necessary at this particular time? What specific purpose would it serve? The responses she received were quick, perhaps a bit too quick. The medical staff assured her it was simply routine, part of a comprehensive health assessment. Nothing unusual, nothing to be concerned about. They maintained their professional demeanor throughout, but Catherine noticed something in their delivery that gave her pause. Years of public life had taught Catherine to read people, to notice the small tells that reveal when someone is not entirely comfortable with what they are saying. She observed how the doctor's eyes would shift away from direct contact when they spoke. There were slight hesitations before answering, pauses that lasted just a fraction too long to feel natural. The room's atmosphere had changed subtly, but unmistakably. What had begun as a straightforward medical appointment now carried an undercurrent of tension that Catherine could not ignore. She watched as the medical staff moved about the room, and she began to notice small exchanges between them. Brief glances, almost imperceptible nods. The kind of silent communication that happens between people who share knowledge they cannot speak aloud. These were professionals who had worked together for years, and their coordination was typically seamless. But today, something was different. They seemed to be operating under constraints that went beyond normal medical protocol. When the time came to draw her blood sample, Catherine remained composed. The procedure itself was straightforward and painless, something she had experienced many times before. But what happened next reinforced her growing sense that this was no ordinary checkup, The vial containing her blood was handled with exceptional care. The staff member who collected it checked and rechecked the label, ensuring every detail was correct. Another staff member verified the information independently. The sample was then sealed with what seemed like unusual formality before being carefully placed in a secure container. This level of attention was striking. While medical samples always require proper handling and labeling, the almost ceremonial precision with which her blood was treated suggested it held particular significance. Catherine had donated blood before, had undergone various medical tests over the years, and never had she witnessed quite this level of meticulous care. The sample was not simply collected and processed. It was treated as though it contained something of extraordinary importance, something that demanded absolute accuracy and security. As she sat there, watching the sealed container being prepared for transport, Catherine felt her unease deepen. The secrecy surrounding this sample went beyond standard medical confidentiality. It felt urgent and weighted with meaning she could not yet grasp. Every action the medical staff took seemed to underscore that this test was not about routine health monitoring. There was a purpose behind it, a reason that no one was willing to articulate directly to her. In that moment, Catherine realized she was no longer simply a patient receiving care. She had become part of something larger, something that extended beyond her individual health and well-being. The thought that pushed its way into her consciousness was both unwelcome and impossible to dismiss. Could this somehow be connected to Princess Diana? The name alone carried immense weight within the palace walls. Diana's legacy had never truly faded. Her memory remained a powerful presence, influencing public perception of the monarchy and shaping conversations about the royal family decades after her death. Catherine had always been aware of Diana's shadow. It was impossible not to be. From the moment her relationship with William became public, comparisons had been drawn between her and William's mother. The parallels in their situations, the expectations placed upon them as women marrying into the royal family, the intense media scrutiny they both faced. These connections had been noted and analyzed countless times over the years, but this felt different. This was not about public perception or media narratives. This was happening behind closed doors, in the private spaces where the royal family's real business was conducted. The silence in that medical room spoke louder than any explanation the doctors could have provided. Their careful avoidance of certain topics, their reluctance to meet her eyes directly, the precision with which they handled her blood sample, all of it pointed to knowledge being withheld. Catherine understood in that moment that whatever this DNA test was meant to reveal, it carried implications that reached far beyond her own life. If Diana's name was somehow connected to this, then the consequences would ripple through the entire institution of the monarchy. As she prepared to leave the appointment, Catherine's mind was racing with questions. What exactly were they testing for? Who had ordered this particular test? What did they expect to find in her blood? And most troubling of all, what would happen when the results came back? The medical staff maintained their professional courtesy as they showed her out, but the atmosphere remained charged with unspoken tension. Catherine walked through the corridors of the palace with a new awareness settling over her. Something significant was unfolding, something that had been set in motion without her knowledge or consent, and she was now at the center of it. The thought would not leave Catherine alone. It followed her through the following days, persistent and unsettling, like a question that demanded an answer, but received only silence. She had always known that living as Princess of Wales meant existing in the shadow of the woman who had held that title before her. Diana's presence was woven into the very fabric of the royal family's recent history, impossible to escape, and perhaps impossible to fully understand. Diana had been more than just a member of the royal family. She had become a cultural icon, a figure who transcended the boundaries of royalty to touch people's lives in ways that few public figures ever manage. Her story was one of extraordinary beauty and devastating tragedy, of a young woman thrust into a role she had not been prepared for, expected to navigate waters that proved treacherous and ultimately overwhelming. The world had watched her struggle, had seen her try to balance personal happiness with public duty, and had mourned when her life ended far too soon. For Catherine, the connection to Diana had always been complex. She had not chosen to be compared to William's mother, but the comparisons were inevitable from the start. Both women had entered the royal family from outside. Both had to learn the intricate rules and expectations of palace life. Both faced intense media scrutiny that examined every aspect of their appearance and behavior. They shared the experience of being thrust into a spotlight that never dimmed, of having their lives analyzed and critiqued by millions of people who felt they had a stake in the royal narrative. But Catherine had always believed these were superficial similarities, connections born of circumstance rather than something deeper. She had her own identity, her own way of approaching royal duties, her own relationship with William that was distinct from his parents' troubled marriage. Or so she had thought. Now, with the memory of that medical appointment fresh in her mind, and the knowledge that a DNA test had been conducted without full explanation, Catherine began to wonder if the connection between herself and Diana went beyond what anyone had previously understood. The sealed blood sample haunted her thoughts. Why had it been handled with such extraordinary care? What were the medical staff looking for in her DNA that required such precision and secrecy? These questions circled through her mind constantly, and with them came a growing sense that forces beyond her control were at work. Something had been set in motion, and she was only beginning to understand that she might be part of a plan that had been years, perhaps decades, in the making. In the days that followed the appointment, Catherine became aware of whispers moving through the palace. These were not the usual rumors that occasionally circulated among staff, the idle gossip about minor matters that any large household generates. These whispers were different. They were quieter, more cautious, passed between people who seemed to understand the gravity of what they were discussing. Catherine did not hear these conversations directly, but she sensed them happening around her, felt the weight of unspoken knowledge in the air. The palace had always been a place of secrets. This was something Catherine had understood from the beginning. An institution that had survived for centuries learned to keep its cards close, to manage information carefully, to present a polished public face, while keeping private matters firmly behind closed doors. But the atmosphere now felt different. There was a tension in the corridors, a sense of anticipation mixed with anxiety that Catherine could not ignore. Staff members who normally met her eyes and exchanged polite conversation now seemed preoccupied, their attention divided between their duties and some other concern they could not or would not articulate. She began to pay closer attention to fragments of conversation, to the things people said, and the things they conspicuously did not say. One afternoon, passing through a corridor near the administrative offices, she overheard two senior staff members speaking in low voices. They stopped abruptly when they noticed her approach, offering polite greetings before moving away. But in that brief moment before they had seen her, Catherine had caught a few words: testing, bloodline, confirmation. The words meant little on their own, but together they suggested something significant was being discussed, something that required privacy and discretion. Other incidents followed. A private secretary, who had always been forthcoming with information, suddenly became vague when Catherine asked about certain administrative matters. A member of the household staff who had worked at the palace for decades gave her a look of what seemed like sympathy mixed with concern, though when Catherine inquired if something was wrong, the staff member simply smiled and said everything was fine. These small moments accumulated, building a picture of something happening just beneath the surface of normal palace life. The rumors, when they finally reached Catherine in more concrete form, were startling. Some of the whispers suggested that the DNA test had not been primarily about her health at all. Instead, according to these accounts, the test was designed to trace connections within her bloodline, to establish links that went back through generations. The suggestion was that someone, somewhere within the palace hierarchy, was looking for evidence of a connection to Diana herself, not the obvious connection through marriage and family, but something more direct, something biological. Other versions of the rumor were even more specific and more disturbing. These accounts claimed that Diana had known something, had been aware of a secret that she had kept close throughout her life. According to these whispers, Diana had hinted at this knowledge in ways that only became clear in retrospect, through careful reading of her interviews and examination of her private correspondence. The monarchy, so these rumors suggested, had been aware of Diana's secret but had chosen to bury it, to keep it hidden away until circumstances forced it into the light. Catherine found herself thinking about Diana's life with new perspective. She recalled the interviews Diana had given, particularly the famous television appearance where she had spoken so candidly about her struggles within the royal family. Diana had talked about feeling isolated and misunderstood, about the pressures of living under constant scrutiny, about her sense that the institution was more concerned with protecting its image than supporting her as a person. At the time, and in the years since, these statements had been interpreted as the words of a woman suffering from a difficult marriage and the stress of public life. But what if there had been more to it? What if Diana's feelings of being watched and controlled had been based on something more concrete than emotional distress? Catherine began to reconsider the fragments of Diana's story that had always seemed somewhat disconnected or difficult to explain. The photographs that showed Diana smiling in public while clearly struggling in private. The letters that had been released after her death, which revealed depths of pain and confusion that the public face never showed. The accounts from people who had known Diana well, who spoke of her belief that she was being monitored, that her movements were being tracked, that people within the palace were working against her. These pieces of Diana's story had always been presented as evidence of her vulnerability, proof of how difficult her position had been, and how the pressures had affected her mental state. But now Catherine wondered if there was another interpretation. What if Diana had not been paranoid or overly emotional? What if her fears had been entirely rational responses to real circumstances? What if she had known something that made her a threat to the established order? And what if the palace had responded by trying to control and contain her? The possibility was deeply unsettling. Catherine had committed her life to the royal family, had dedicated herself to serving the institution and upholding its values and traditions. She believed in the importance of the monarchy as a stabilizing force in British society, as a connection to history and continuity in a rapidly changing world. But if the institution had actively worked to suppress truth, to hide information that Diana had tried to bring to light, then Catherine's entire understanding of her role would need to be reconsidered. She thought about the DNA test again, about the careful handling of her blood sample, and the secrecy surrounding its purpose. If the test was indeed meant to confirm a connection to Diana, what would that mean? What secret could Diana have carried that would require genetic confirmation decades after her death? And why would this matter now, at this particular moment in time? Catherine realized that she was not just wondering about the past. She was wondering about the future, about what would happen when the test results came back, and whatever truth they contained could no longer be hidden. The weight of these questions pressed on her constantly. She maintained her public duties, attending events and carrying out her responsibilities with the same grace and professionalism that had always characterized her approach to royal life. But privately, she was struggling with uncertainty and growing concern about what was happening behind the scenes, in the rooms and corridors where decisions were made and secrets were kept. The night before the results were expected, sleep proved impossible for Catherine. She found herself wandering through the quiet corridors of Kensington Palace, her footsteps echoing softly against the polished floors. The palace at night was a different place from its daytime self. Without the constant activity of staff and visitors, without the demands of schedules and appointments, it became a space where the past felt closer somehow, more tangible. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her as she passed, faces from centuries of royal history staring down with expressions that could have been judgment or sympathy or simple observation. Catherine's thoughts kept returning to Diana. She tried to imagine what Diana must have felt during her own sleepless nights in these same corridors, in this same building where she had lived and struggled and ultimately left behind. The similarities between their situations were striking in ways that Catherine had not fully appreciated until now. Both had married into the royal family with hope and optimism. Both had discovered that the reality of royal life was far more complicated than the fairy tale version the public imagined. Both had learned that duty and personal happiness did not always align, and that the institution would always prioritize its own preservation above individual well-being. But Catherine sensed there was something more, something specific that connected her to Diana in ways that went beyond these general parallels. The DNA test suggested a biological link, a connection written into the very fabric of their bodies. If this was true, if the test confirmed what the whispers and rumors had suggested, then Diana's story was not just a cautionary tale or a tragic chapter in royal history. It was directly relevant to Catherine's own life, to her place in the family, to her children's future. The thought was overwhelming. Catherine had always approached her role with careful consideration, weighing her words and actions, trying to honor the traditions of the institution, while also bringing her own perspective and values. She had studied Diana's experiences, had learned from both her successes and her mistakes, had tried to chart a course that would allow her to serve effectively while maintaining her sense of self. But if there was a deeper connection, one that had been hidden all this time, then everything she thought she understood about her position would need to be reconsidered. Morning came eventually, bringing with it a soft knock on her door. Catherine had been expecting it, but the reality still made her heart race. A private secretary entered, carrying a single envelope. It was plain and official looking, marked only with the royal insignia that appeared on all formal palace correspondence. The secretary's face was carefully neutral, revealing nothing about the contents or their significance. Catherine accepted the envelope with steady hands, though inside she felt anything but steady. After the secretary left, Catherine sat alone with the envelope for several long minutes. She knew that opening it would change everything. Whatever information lay inside, whatever the test had revealed, would mark a dividing line between the life she had known and whatever came next. There would be no going back, no way to unknow what she was about to learn. The weight of the envelope seemed disproportionate to its physical size, as though it contained not just paper and ink, but the accumulated history of years of secrets and silence. Finally, she broke the seal. The paper inside was standard medical documentation, formatted in the clinical language that healthcare professionals use to convey information with precision and detachment. Catherine's eyes scanned the text, trying to process what she was reading. The technical terminology was dense, filled with genetic markers and probability percentages, but the essential meaning became clear as she worked through the document. The test had confirmed a connection. Not the expected familial relationship through marriage, but something more direct, something that existed in her DNA itself. The implications crashed over her in waves. This was not about family trees or genealogical curiosity. This was evidence of something that should not have been possible according to the accepted narrative of royal history. The results indicated a biological link to Diana that went beyond what any public records had ever suggested. Catherine felt her understanding of reality shifting beneath her feet. If this was true, and the scientific evidence suggested it was, then there had been secrets kept for decades, information deliberately hidden and suppressed. She thought about William, about the stories he had shared with her over the years about his mother. He had spoken of Diana's loneliness, of her sense that she was trapped within a system that neither understood nor cared about her as a person. He had described her fears, her belief that she was being watched and controlled, that people within the palace were working against her rather than supporting her. William had shared these memories with a mixture of sadness and frustration, mourning his mother while also trying to make sense of what had happened to her and why. Catherine had always listened with sympathy, but she had also maintained a certain distance from Diana's experiences. She had told herself that times were different now, that the royal family had learned from past mistakes, that the institution had evolved and would not repeat the errors that had contributed to Diana's unhappiness. But now, holding these test results in her hands, Catherine realized how naive that perspective had been. The institution had not changed as much as she had believed. It was still capable of keeping profound secrets, still willing to hide truth in the name of preservation and continuity. The rumors about Diana that had circulated for years suddenly seemed less like conspiracy theories and more like legitimate concerns. People had speculated about why Diana had felt so isolated, why she had seemed convinced that forces within the palace were working against her, why she had taken certain actions that appeared extreme or irrational to outside observers. The common explanation had been that Diana was emotionally unstable, that the pressures of royal life and her troubled marriage had affected her judgment and mental health. This narrative had been convenient for the institution because it placed the blame on Diana herself, rather than on the system that had failed to support her. But what if Diana had not been wrong? What if her instincts had been correct, and she had recognized that something significant was being hidden from public view? The DNA results suggested that this was exactly the case. Diana had not been paranoid or delusional. She had been responding rationally to a situation in which important information was being concealed, in which the truth about her own position and connections within the family was being actively suppressed. Catherine felt a chill run through her as she considered what this meant. The palace had known, or at least some people within the palace hierarchy had known, about whatever secret these DNA results had now confirmed. They had chosen to keep it hidden, not just from the public, but apparently from Diana herself. The level of control and manipulation that this implied was staggering. It meant that the institution had been willing to let Diana suffer, to allow her to feel isolated and persecuted, rather than reveal information that might have helped her understand her true situation. The implications for Catherine herself were equally troubling. If the palace had hidden this information for so long, keeping it secret through Diana's lifetime and beyond, then what did that say about how the institution viewed the people within it? Catherine had always believed that despite its formality and tradition, the royal family ultimately cared about its members, that there was genuine concern for individual well-being beneath the layers of protocol and duty. But these test results suggested otherwise. They suggested that when the institution's interests conflicted with individual truth and dignity, the institution would always choose its own preservation. She thought about her children, about George, Charlotte, and Louis, and what their lives would be like growing up within this system. She had always wanted them to have as normal a childhood as possible within the constraints of their position, to grow up with a sense of security and love that would help them navigate the unique pressures they would face. But now she wondered what secrets might be kept from them, what information about their own history and identity might be hidden in the name of maintaining appearances and protecting the institution. The document in her hands was more than just medical information. It was evidence of a fundamental problem within the monarchy itself, a willingness to prioritize image over truth, control over transparency, institutional preservation over individual well-being. Catherine realized that she now faced a choice that would define the rest of her life within the royal family. She could accept the silence that had protected this secret for so long, could allow the information to remain hidden as it had been throughout Diana's lifetime, or she could push for truth, could demand that the full story be acknowledged and addressed, regardless of the consequences for the institution. The weight of this decision pressed upon her as she sat alone with the test results. She knew that whatever she chose would have enormous implications, not just for herself, but for William, for their children, for the entire royal family and its relationship with the British people. The truth had remained hidden for decades, buried beneath layers of protocol and carefully managed public relations. But now it had been brought to light, forced into the open by a simple medical test, and Catherine held the power to determine what happened next. William stood at a crossroads that would have been unimaginable just weeks earlier. The man who had spent his entire life being prepared for his future role as king now found himself torn between the institution he was meant to serve and the truth that demanded recognition. For years, he had been taught that the monarchy came first, that personal feelings and individual concerns had to be set aside in service of something larger and more enduring. This principle had been instilled in him from childhood, reinforced through every stage of his education and training. But this situation was different in ways that made those lessons seem inadequate and even hollow. The palace had made its position abundantly clear through a series of carefully orchestrated meetings and private conversations. Senior advisors and courtiers had approached William with increasing urgency, each visit bringing the same essential message wrapped in slightly different language. The institution's survival depended on maintaining certain boundaries, on preserving the dignity and mystery that had allowed the monarchy to endure through centuries of social and political change. Silence was not just preferred, they insisted. It was necessary. The alternative, they warned, would be chaos and uncertainty that could undermine public confidence in the entire royal system. These arguments were presented as objective assessments of risk, as the considered judgment of people who had dedicated their lives to protecting the monarchy. But William could hear the fear beneath their measured words. They were not worried about abstract principles or theoretical dangers. They were worried about their own positions, about the power structures that had elevated them and given them influence within the palace hierarchy. The truth that Catherine now held threatened to expose not just old secrets, but current failures, to reveal that the institution they claimed to serve had been willing to sacrifice individual well-being for the sake of maintaining appearances. William's internal conflict ran deeper than questions of institutional loyalty. This was about his mother, about Diana, and the suffering she had endured during her years in the royal family. He had lived through those years as a child and young man, watching his mother struggle with isolation and unhappiness, seeing her try to find meaning and purpose within a system that seemed designed to constrain rather than support her. He had mourned her death and spent years trying to understand what had happened to her and why. Now, confronted with evidence that suggested she had been right about many of her fears and concerns, William faced a terrible realization. The institution he was meant to defend had failed his mother in profound and unforgivable ways. The palace corridors had taken on a different atmosphere in recent days. Catherine noticed it most acutely, but William felt it too. There was surveillance disguised as concern, monitoring presented as support. Advisors and staff members who normally kept a respectful distance now seemed to be everywhere, always watching, always aware of what Catherine was doing and who she was speaking with. The official explanation was that they were simply ensuring her well-being during a stressful time, making sure she had everything she needed. But the reality was transparently different. They were making sure she did not speak out of turn, did not share information that the institution wanted to keep contained. Catherine was no longer treated as a trusted member of the family, but as a potential threat that needed to be managed and controlled. Every conversation she had was noted. Every movement through the palace was observed. The pretense of normalcy had worn thin, revealing the machinery of control that operated beneath the surface of royal life. William watched this happening and felt a mixture of anger and shame. Anger at the institution for treating his wife this way, and shame that he had not recognized earlier how the same dynamics must have affected his mother. He remembered stories Diana had told him, accounts of feeling watched and constrained, of sensing that people around her were reporting on her activities to others higher up in the palace hierarchy. At the time, William had not fully understood what she meant. He had been young, and the complexities of palace politics were beyond his comprehension. As he grew older and learned more about how the institution functioned, he had sometimes wondered if his mother had been overly sensitive, if the pressures of her position had made her see conspiracies where there were only routine administrative procedures. Now he knew better. Diana had not been imagining things. She had been responding accurately to a real situation in which she was being monitored and controlled. The evening when Catherine finally showed him the test results would remain etched in William's memory forever. They were alone in their private quarters, away from the staff and advisors who seemed to be constantly present elsewhere in the palace. Catherine's hands trembled slightly as she passed him the envelope. She did not need to explain what it was or why it mattered. The weight of the moment was evident in her expression, in the careful way she handled the documents, in the silence that filled the room. William opened the envelope and began to read. The technical language of the medical report required careful attention, but the essential findings were clear enough. The DNA test had revealed a connection that should not have existed according to everything William had been told about his family's history. He read through the results once, then again, hoping that he had misunderstood or misinterpreted the information. But there was no ambiguity in the findings. The scientific evidence was conclusive and undeniable. His first reaction was disbelief. This could not be accurate. There must have been some mistake in the testing process, some contamination of samples or error in analysis. But as he examined the documentation more carefully, noting the multiple confirmatory tests that had been conducted and the rigorous protocols that had been followed, he realized that the results were legitimate. This was not a mistake. This was truth that had been hidden for decades, kept secret through deliberate effort and systematic suppression of information. William set the papers down and sat in silence for a long time. Catherine waited, understanding that he needed space to process what he had just learned. Eventually he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. He talked about his mother, about the memories he carried of her final years, when she had seemed increasingly desperate to escape the constraints of royal life. He spoke about conversations they had had, moments when Diana had tried to explain to him why she felt so trapped and isolated. At the time, William had not fully grasped what she was trying to communicate. Now, with the test results in front of him, her words took on new and painful meaning. The conspiracy of silence that had surrounded Diana's experiences was not a product of her imagination or emotional instability. It had been real, systematic, and deliberately maintained by people who valued institutional preservation over individual truth and dignity. William realized that his mother had been fighting against something much larger and more entrenched than he had previously understood. She had been trying to expose secrets that powerful people wanted to keep hidden, trying to bring truth into an environment that functioned on carefully constructed narratives and selective disclosure.